Now on to our speaker, who tonight is Dr. Robert David. He's a member of the Klamath tribes of the Northwest and holds a master's in anthropology from Portland State University and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, also in anthropology. His research for both degrees involved Klamath Basin rock art. He has taught both anthropology and Native American studies at UC Berkeley and currently teaches anthropology courses at Portland State. His summers are spent doing fieldwork for the Forest Service, and he has an ongoing field project in the Klamath Basin that's in its 19th year. The project, with the assistance of friends and volunteers, concentrates on locating and documenting previously known and unknown rock art sites. Currently, he's also working on 2 projects that involve Petroglyph Point, which he discussed a bit during the coffee hour here. That's a site within Lava Beds National Monument in Northern California. His projects involve a book based on his research over the past 7 years at the monument. And the second is a film documentary regarding understanding the petroglyphs from the perspective of the Klamath Modoc belief system. He plans to continue research in the Klamath Basin, teaching in the university system, and developing curriculums that include and centralize Native epistemologies. Tonight, he will speak about spirit songs and sacred fire, considering Native perspectives through the understanding of Klamath Basin myth. Please welcome Dr. David.
Okay, well, so again, thanks Mavis for that awesome introduction. Sorry about the delay, folks. I'd like to start off by thanking Donna Gillette for who asked me to do this presentation on ARARA's behalf. And in spite of my slow coming forth with the book chapter I promised, there's really little I wouldn't do for her. And thank you to those who made this Zoom lecture possible. I mean, it's just awesome to see organizations like yours soldiering on in spite of all of our current challenges. And I can't get away with this. I got to thank Todd Keppel of the Klamath County Museum, who let me use this room tonight for better internet connectivity than in my humble little RV. So tonight's talk about Petroglyph Point is going to take me about 1 hour and 5 minutes. I've been able to consistently time it to that period. I'm going to start off by providing some general information about the monument's physical characteristics. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the earliest inquiries made about the petroglyphs and how answers to these inquiries influenced the research that followed. Then after that, I'm going to spend a great deal of time talking about Klamath and Modoc mythology. And the reason for this is because my main argument here is that myth, when understood through the framework of shamanism, is the appropriate mechanism for understanding the Petroglyph Point petroglyphs. And then finally, we'll examine some of the petroglyphs within this shamanic mythological framework, and then hopefully have time for questions afterwards. So Petroglyph, excuse me. So Petroglyph Point then is situated at the northeastern boundary of the Lava Beds National Monument near Tule Lake, California, within the traditional homeland of the Modoc. And the red square on the upper right-hand side of the screen identifies its location. And just FYI, this site's been developed for the public for a very long time now, so I'm not giving away anything taboo here. Now, some of you may recall that before around 1780, the Klamath and the Modoc peoples were actually a single group that were collectively known as the Muclucs, or the people. Now, each of the smaller groups within that overarching tribal structure further identified themselves by the geological feature near where they lived. And thus the people of the southern lake, which is now called Tule Lake, were called the Modalkni Muclucs. And these were the people who would later on be simply called the Modoc. Now, this map here shows the original territory for both of these groups, with the Klamath in the north, surrounded by the dotted reservation boundaries, and the Modoc in the south. And this red arrow here shows the imaginary line that divided them. And here is the general area that we're interested in tonight, which is more or less central to Modoc territory. Now today, as you can see, the petroglyphs are protected by this chain link fence, which is indicated by the arrow on the right. Now, this was erected in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps in an effort to put a stop to the tourists who'd literally been chunking off sections of the petroglyphs and then carting them home as souvenirs. Now, unfortunately, the fence doesn't protect all of the petroglyphs, and vandalism has continued to occur even as late as 2013. And this latest occurrence, in fact, is what inspired me to focus my research on this monument so that we can learn as much about it as we can while we can. And I should also mention that it inspired me to do this documentary, which I described in a flyer, but I think it's actually on a link on your website. Now, the peninsula is considered to be the very heart of Modoc territory, not only in terms of its location, but also because of its spiritual importance. The Klamath and Modoc both regard this mountain as the creation point, where the creator spirit Camous first created dry land by scooping up clay from the bottom of Tule Lake and then using it to form this mountain. Then afterwards, he was said to have made the rest of the Earth's landmass from this point outward, somewhat in the nature of weaving a basket. Now, according to our ancestral beliefs, any place on the landscape where spirits acted or lived are thought to be charged with their supernatural power. And so this mountain's creation by a spirit already makes this mountain a sacred place. And this in turn makes the peninsula a place where certain people would travel to in their own search for supernatural power. And I say certain people because the marking suggests that this site was reserved for shamans or kukes, who were the ritual practitioners of the tribes. Such markings, in fact, were thought to be dangerous or even deadly to those who were not initiated, by which I mean those people who were not shamans. Anyway, this kind of information, which the earliest researchers weren't really interested in at the time, actually offers us very significant clues about the nature of the petroglyphs carved all over this mountain. And this, in fact, is what we're going to be exploring throughout this presentation, this mountain's sacred connotations and what they have to do with the petroglyphs. So here's some examples of the imagery. And as you can see, some of the glyphs were made with an engraving instrument, perhaps like a beveled deer femur or something of that nature, while others were made by a sharp, were incised with a sharper instrument, like the edge of a projectile point or maybe a deer antler or something of that nature. And curiously enough, others were made by drilling holes into the rock face, sometimes in a way that created patterns, but not always. And I suppose I should mention at this point that the peninsula itself is made up of wilted volcanic tuff, which has the consistency of sandstone. And that, of course, is what made carving and drilling petroglyphs into the rock face so easy. Now, according to the latest estimate, the monument contains more than 5,000 images that range from somewhat naturalistic figures to others that have been called geometric abstract. By naturalistic, I mean figures that are recognizable, okay, like the human and insect figures shown over on the far left. The so-called geometric abstract figures consist of things like groups of wavy lines, zigzags, grids, circles, triangles, bisected lines, much like the composition you see over on the right. Now, looking at these images, especially the so-called geometric abstract figures, it's not hard to see why they've teased the public's imagination or intrigued researchers for well over a century now. I mean, over the years, they've been called things like maps, astronomical charts, solstice markers, doodling, ancient Scandinavian fish tallies, the writing system of vanished civilizations, and so on and so forth. See, in the earliest days of research, especially right after the Modoc War, when tensions were still very high, it was just hard for Westerners to accept that this petroglyph concentration had anything at all to do with the ancestral Klamath and Modoc, especially the Modoc. And this, as you might imagine, influenced both the type and the quality of research that followed. Anyway, please keep this geometric abstract composition in mind, because we're going to return to it at the end of our discussion today. And my purpose will be to use this composition to demonstrate that the petroglyphs on this monument are knowable. In spite of over a century of claims made to the contrary, these petroglyphs are knowable, and they're knowable in a Klamath and in a Modoc way. That's my claim. Now, the earliest inquiry about the petroglyphs that I'm aware of came at the conclusion of the Modoc War in 1873. Two military officers had asked an old Indian man what the petroglyphs were all about, and he replied that his papas, repeating the word papa, apparently in an effort to convey the site's great antiquity. Now, just a few years later, in 1881, Dr. James Dennison, who is the physician at the Klamath Indian Agency, received a nearly identical reply from the Klamath Indians about one of their pictograph sites near Klamath Lake. The general consensus among the Indians, he wrote, is that Mokas had created rock art when he first created the world. Oh, and Mokas, by the way, is the Klamath name for the creator spirit, Camous. And I'll be using both names interchangeably this evening, depending on which source I'm citing at the moment. Anyway, like the Modoc, the Klamath emphasized the rock art's spiritual origins and its great antiquity, made at the beginning of time. Now, as you can see from this quote from Leslie Spear's ethnography on the Klamath around 50 years later, once again, the Klamath denied having made the pictographs at all, attributing their creation once again to the spirit Mokas. Now, even though these stories, well, didn't make a lot of sense to the earliest researchers who inquired about Petroglyph Point, they actually provide us with very significant clues pertaining to its actual origin and purpose. But in order to understand all that, we need to understand first the ritual philosophy that inspired both the petroglyphs and, of course, these somewhat cryptic statements made by the ancestral Klamath and Modoc. And that's because they both stem from the same worldview. In other words, they both stem from the myths. We have to consider the myths. Let's look again at that quote from Leslie Spear's ethnography on the Klamath. And by the way, there's a flash here in which he stated that the Klamath do not make pictographs. The few sites that exist in their country were said to have been made by Mokas, the culture hero. See, Spear had assumed that the Klamath attributed the creation of rock art to Mokas because they were just as unaware of its origin as anyone else. And this idea, in turn, led him and subsequent researchers to conclude that Klamath Basin rock art was unknowable, including the rock art of Petroglyph Point, simply because nobody appeared to know who actually made it. And as a result, most of the researchers that followed simply assumed that some mysterious Klamath Basin predecessor had made them prior to the arrival of the ancestral Klamath and Modoc, and that these predecessors had either gone extinct or had long since moved on. And so subsequently, all of their research was geared toward discovering the real makers of the rock art, while simultaneously dismissing information provided by the ancestral Klamath and Modoc. But in actuality, what Spear, oh, dare I say it, failed to grasp is that those of our ancestors who were contributing their knowledge to his ethnography were speaking from a worldview that was peculiar to most Westerners, including Western ethnologists, a worldview that was deeply grounded in myth, or as we prefer, our sacred narratives. Native peoples, especially in the greater North American far west, generally believed that spirits dwell at certain places in the earth, and that when people ritually tapped into their power, well, they were understood to become those spirits. That is, that the spirits were understood to enter the bodies of the supplicants and then animate their actions. And so, for example, if they claimed that a water spirit made a particular rock painting, they were talking about a person, probably a shaman, who had successfully acquired the supernatural powers of the water spirit and then made the painting as the water spirit. That is, that the water spirit was understood to be animating the actions of the artist. Well, in our myths, Mokas or Camous was every shaman's tutelary spirit. Shamans cannot ritually act without the supernatural assistance of Mokas. And in fact, by definition, that's the shaman's job, to channel spirits and then to use their power. So from the point of view then Oh, so when shamans, excuse me, so when shamans created rock art, then our ancestors understood that it was Kamokams who was animating their actions. And so from the point of view of Spear's informants, Kamokams did in fact make the rock art, even though they may have seen the person of the shaman doing the actual painting. They understood intuitively that it was Kamokams working through them, and they simply explained this to Spear from their own cultural perspective. But as I said, Spear, I hate to say it like this, but missed this important connection between spirits, shamans, and rock art, and thus his understanding fell short. Like others, he failed to explore the sacred ideology that had inspired their answers. The Union says I get a quick coffee break. In actuality, rock art is an expression of the spiritual ideology contained in Klamath and Modoc myth, in the very same sense that a stained glass window from a Gothic cathedral is an expression of Christianity, but with one fundamental difference. See, whereas the Christian materials touch on your sense of aesthetics in order to reinforce the Christian doctrine, well, to inspire, the images that make up Klamath Basin rock art, in addition to doing all the above, also constitute the shaman's toolkit. And by this, I mean that these glyphs and paintings tended to serve very specific roles within the shamanic practice. And these roles, once again, are described in great detail in the region's mythology. So for the past 20 some years now, I've looked to these sacred narratives in order to inform my, my understanding of Klamath Basin rock art. And I started out doing this for two basic reasons. First off, I discovered early on that these sacred narratives actually identify powerful supernatural beings. Now, just a casual comparison with the ethnographic materials makes it very clear that these powerful beings of myth are also the spirit helpers that shamans use in their ritual practice. Well, my claim then is that these are the very spirit helpers we see depicted in Petroglyph Point rock art. That's what I'm attempting to demonstrate this evening. This is my bridging argument. My second reason was that myth harbors the logic of the spirit world, how it operated. For example, everything in the spirit world was inverted or reversed from the natural physical world. Day here is night there. Mountains here are valleys there. What we would call bad behavior in the physical world is good behavior in the spirit world, and so on and so forth. Well, this law of inversion is also present in much of the rock art, sometimes in ways that are subtle, sometimes not so subtle. But that's why I chose the image over here on the right. Now, I'm not completely sure what this figure is, although I do have some ideas. But as you can see, this image forms a true reflection of itself, divided by this fissure here in the rock face. So the concept of inversion is represented here. And let me quickly add that it's no accident that the artists organized these figures around this natural fissure. And the reason for this is because cracks and fissures were believed to be portals or entrances into the spirit world, okay, which of course was located inside the earth. So by incorporating the fissure into this depiction, the artist effectively associated these figures with the supernatural world. And this, of course, means that these figures were inspired by an understanding of the spirit world and with the laws that govern it. So in short, then, these stories constitute our ancestral worldview. And as such, there's no way we can understand rock art or any of the indigenous statements made about the rock art without understanding these sacred narratives, because therein lies the ritual philosophy that inspired their creation. So, mouth is drying up. Returning to my first point, I want to turn your attention now to some spirit beings that I've been able to identify in Klamath Basin rock art by consulting Klamath and Modoc mythology. And as might be expected, the first and most widely known of these spirit beings is, of course, Camous. And again, the Klamath call him Kamokams. Now, as I previously stated, Camous is our creator spirit, but he's also considered to be the spirit of the sun. All throughout these tales, Camous is intimately associated with the sun disk. The sun disk, in fact, was his medicine or his spirit tool, essentially his mechanism for wielding supernatural power. Well, by virtue of the sun's regenerative properties, Camous's possession of the sun disk made him immortal, and it gave him the ability to cure or to rejuvenate the sick, and even to bring people back to life. So this, in effect, makes the sun disk a supernatural curing tool. Well, once again, Camous is the creator of shamanism, and thus every shaman's tutelary spirit. So by channeling the spirit Camous, shamans were also able to harness the sun's regenerative properties and likewise use them to cure the sick. And in fact, that's the shaman's primary role in the community, to cure by supernatural means. And so what this means then is that Camous's sun disk was available to shamans as a medicine tool. And this is why we see it depicted in the rock art. It was a shaman's tool, or a mutwas, just as Spear's ethnography had indicated. And attesting to this is the fact that the sun disk itself had a spirit song, or as Gatchett puts it, a Tamanawash song. Tamanawash is Chinook and jargon for pretty much the same thing, anything to do with spirit power. See, incantations or spirit songs were the primary means through which shamans invoked their spirit helpers. To invoke a spirit or a spirit's medicine tool like the sun disk, they had to have the proper song given to them by that spirit. And in fact, Gatchett's observation here about shamans singing to painted rocks indicates that these paintings depicted their spirit helpers. And the reason I can make this claim is that because among the Klamath and Modoc, the concepts of singing and spirit being were one and the same thing. My ancestors recognized no distinction between a spirit or its song, its invocation song. In fact, as Spear points out right here, one word was used to describe both simultaneously, Suis. So singing to painted rocks was the same thing as singing to their spirit helpers. And once again, this is why we see the sun disk depicted in the rock art. Another powerful spirit described in these narratives is Skell, the mythical pine marten. A pine marten is a tree-dwelling animal characterized by its elongated body and its triangular head. Now, like Camous, Skell was one of the primary medicine spirits in myth, and accordingly, he also had a number of spirit songs, which shamans used to invoke him into their ritual service. Now, in some of these tales, his role is to provide supernatural curing through the use of his medicine stick, which he typically carried behind his ear like a pencil. In other tales, his role is to help shamans to diagnose the supernatural cause of a disease by scouting out the landscape from the treetops, keeping a lookout for all these malicious disease-causing spirits that might be approaching the village from afar, or just as commonly, lurking in dark places within. Only shamans could discover these spirits through the use of their spirit helpers, like Skell. Now, like all the semi-naturalistic images that you see depicted in Klamath Basin rock art, a Skell was typically depicted in stick-figured form. And this is because the artist didn't want to depict an actual physical pine marten. Instead, they wanted to depict the essence or the soul of a pine marten, something without flesh, so that the viewer would understand that what was being conveyed here was spiritual rather than natural, and thus they would know to keep away, since this kind of medicine was dangerous to non-shamans. And the way that Klamath Basin shamans routinely accomplished this was by depicting only its most basic and recognizable characteristics. In this case, its elongated body and its triangular head. This is an artistic convention known as synecdoche, where a part represents the whole. And we see this convention used all too frequently throughout Klamath Basin rock art, as you'll soon come to discover. Now, with that being said, Skell is also sometimes depicted as a stylized human figure. Here, for example, we see his triangular head on top of a human-like body, another common convention in North American rock art, where spirits are presented in human-like form. Now, one explanation for this arrangement is that this figure is a self-portrait created by a shaman who had successfully acquired Skell as a medicine spirit, probably during something like a power quest, which I'll talk about later. But they're seen here as one and the same being because the spirit is possessing and thus empowering its human host. So whoever this image depicts in, he or she is presented here as being fully potent to cure by supernatural means, which of course is the very essence of shamanism. Now notice that Skell carries his medicine stick right up here where his ear would be, just like the tales describe. Like Camus's sun disk, Skell's medicine stick had the power to regenerate life. Now, there are still other times when all we see in the rock art is Skell's triangular head, another example of synecdoche. On the upper left, for example, we see Skell's head possibly depicted alongside his medicine stick right here, although it is somewhat obscured by the lichens, so I can't be too certain. And on the right, we see the head of Skell depicted here, just below Camus's large sun discs, or sun disk, and in this case, his medicine stick is missing. Okay, so once again, then, Skell was used for both diagnosing cases of sickness and disease and for ritual curing by means of his medicine stick. Now, the myths are just teeming with examples of his ritual exploits. And again, this is why we see Skell depicted in the rock art. Another spirit associated with the shaman's ritual curing practice is Old Man Mokas, the owl spirit. Now, the owl spirit actually turns up all over in Klamath Basin rock art, including the rock art of Petroglyph Point, which you can see on the far right. And yes, that was supposed to flash. Now, what makes the owl so vital to the shaman's ritual practice was, of course, its amazing vision, which enables it to hunt at nighttime. In other words, its vision enables it to see things hidden in dark places. So again, by way of metaphor, any shaman possessing this spirit's extraordinary vision was empowered to see things like hidden malicious spirits that might be causing sickness and disease. Or to put it another way, it enabled shamans to reach diagnoses, the supernatural cause of a sickness. Now note that the owl's eyes are the primary feature emphasized in the rock art. And in fact, if you notice, the shaman's incantation here makes a very specific reference to the owl's vision, which Gatchett actually goes on to explain in a little further detail here below. And the quote below here is one of several footnotes in which Gatchett was trying to unpack the cultural meaning of each of the many incantations that he included in his ethnographic sketch. Now, the horned owl seems to be a favorite in Klamath Basin rock art, as well as in the myths. But occasionally, we do see depictions of other owl species as well. For example, this heart-shaped figure from Petroglyph Point might at first strike the ordinary park visitor as a valentine of a sort. And in fact, I've heard somebody drone on about that very thing in one of my more enjoyable visits to Petroglyph Point. But in actuality, what we're seeing here is a representation of a barn owl. Note the outline of its face. See, in this figure, the artist simply chose to depict what he or she considered to be the most important or defining characteristic of the barn owl. And once again, this is an example of synecdoche. Now, like the horned owl, the barn owl specialized in hunting its prey at nighttime. And this in turn made it an ideal spirit helper. Using the barn owl as a medicine, shamans could seek out and eradicate dangerous hidden spirits that might be causing sickness or threatening harm within the village. Finally, another very powerful spirit among the Klamath and Modoc is the skulks. Now, in the myths, skulks are typically described as being half visible, with the visible portion looking much like a skeleton, or sometimes like an old woman bearing a bundle. But sometimes in the tales, skulks takes on the appearance of a wood tick. Now, why a wood tick, you might ask? And to be honest, I'm darn glad you did. Keeping in mind that all sicknesses were thought to have a supernatural origin, the most common diagnosis for an unexplained illness was the intrusive object disease, in which some malicious spirit was thought to have placed a malignant object into a person's body, leading to their sickness. Well, the cure for this was for the shaman to locate the object in the person's body, of course, with the help of supernatural vision, bite the patient in that area, and I do mean biting, and then remove the object by sucking it out of them. The final step, of course, was to destroy the object in some way. Well, by way of analogy with this curing procedure, the wood tick made a very suitable medicine spirit to facilitate the shaman's ritual actions as he or she removed the intrusive object. And this, of course, is because ticks, well, what do? They embed themselves in your body and suck your blood. Now, note the Klamath incantation here recorded by Albert Gatchett. Certain bugs, like the wood tick, had a spirit song, and thus a means by which shamans could call them into their ritual service and use them in precisely this way. And hence the words of the song. And this is why we see wood ticks and other bugs of this nature depicted at Klamath Basin rock art sites, including this wood tick here in the center from Petroglyph Point. Stylized wood tick, by the way. Okay, so to briefly reiterate, okay, myth identifies powerful supernatural beings. And once again, these are the same beings that shamans used as their spirit helpers and subsequently depicted in Klamath Basin rock art. That was my first point and what I hopefully just demonstrated. My second point, if you recall, is that myth harbors the logic of the spirit world. Now, this is extremely important because it's this logic that both structures and justifies ritual actions, including the creation and use of rock art. Now, for those of you who might be familiar with these types of narratives, Indian myths, legends, folklore, things of that nature, you probably noticed pretty early on that they don't follow the linear organization that's characteristic of Western literature at all. All right, the story's trajectory changes frequently. It changes without warning. And the characters seldom, if ever, act in a way that you and I might consider to be rational. Anything in these tales is possible. An ordinary bug can suddenly will itself to the size of an elk. It could talk. It could fly. It could even change itself into another species entirely. And similarly, the people in these tales could fly. They could live underwater. They could walk through walls. Or they can instantly recover from death and dismemberment and then go on with their day as if nothing unusual had just taken place. So the world of myth then was very bizarre, and it seemed to operate much like our dreams. In fact, the more you read or the more you hear these tales being told, the more you come to realize that dreams are the organizing principle for these narratives. Now, this is important because what this means is that these narratives are grounded on our concept of the spirit world, which our ancestors believed they experienced during dreams. So critical were dreams for spiritual encounters that the ancestral Klamath and Modoc repeatedly embarked on what's called power quests throughout the whole course of their lives, starting at puberty. Now, on these quests, excuse me, initiates would venture alone into the wilderness where spirits live, and then spend the next several nights engaging in a lot of counterintuitive labor, whose only payoff was exhaustion and fatigue. Now, and by counterintuitive labor, I'm not talking about worthless labor, but I am talking about the kind of labor that brought you no practical physical reward, like the acquisition of food, or the shaping of a tool, or the building of a lodge. And that's because the goal for all of this ritualized labor was to induce a dream in which you were visited by spirits. Other folks would call this kind of dream a vision or a trance. So in this regard, then, counterintuitive labor was a pathway to the spirits. Counterintuitive labor was a pathway to the spirits, because the resulting dreams placed you on the doorstep of the spirit world, where visions and spirit visitations were possible. So how then did dreams give you supernatural power? If you've ever noticed, the landscape in your dreams is informed by your knowledge of the landscape in the natural physical world. Even if you don't recognize a specific location that you're dreaming about, you'll still see mountains, you'll still see trees, grass, sidewalks, buildings, and so on and so forth. So the landscape in your dreams isn't all that different from the landscape in the natural physical world. It's in your physical limitations that we see the difference. See, in dreams, you can do almost anything. In dreams, you're capable of performing the very same feats as the supernatural beings of myth. You can fly, you can live underwater, you can instantly teleport yourself to some other location of the world, often without transition. It's also common to visit loved ones who have long since passed away, i.e., gone to the spirit world. And sometimes it's even possible to visit with spirits. So it follows then that dreams are where you would go for spiritual counsel, or sometimes to acquire for yourself the supernatural properties of spirits. Now, the ethnographer Albert Gatchett stated this idea very clearly in his quote here below. Dreams are to the savage man, as he put it, what the Bible is to us, the source of divine revelation, with the important difference that he can produce revelation through dreams at will. And he was referring, of course, to the power quests. So for the Klamath and Modoc, then, dreams were the source of all things spiritual. And accordingly, myths were told as dreamtime narratives because that identified them as being sacred. These are stories of supernatural power grounded in our concept of the spirit world. And thus they constitute the worldview from which shamans drew their powers to cure, to control the weather, to see into the future, all those things that shamans do. And just as importantly, myth also outlines the ritual procedures that shamans used to gain access to those powers. And these procedures, as it turns out, often included the creation and use of rock art. Okay, so the 2 points that I just detailed, or belabored as you will, are critical for understanding the rock art of the Klamath Basin. So now at this juncture, I want to spend the remainder of our time zeroing in on Petroglyph Point and start bringing this all together. Now, in preparation for this, there's just 2 very quick things we need to understand specifically about this monument. The first is that our ancestors believed that spirits live within the peninsula. Now, in recognition of this, my claim is that the petroglyphs depict many of these spirits. And once again, this is my bridging argument, what I'm hoping to demonstrate. The second is that our ancestors believed that shamans could access these spirits through dreams or trance and consult with them on matters related to their ritual practice, the most common of which was ritual curing. Now, this latter point about ritual curing is critical here because it brings us to one of the most important spirits in the shaman's curing enterprise, a spirit that was second only to Camous himself. And this is a spirit we called Yayehiyahas. Yayehiyahas. Now, Yayehiyahas, according to the ethnographer Albert Gatchett, was the spirit of thunder. And as such, he wields thunder's terrible weapon, which of course was Lamaesh, or lightning. Lightning was the spirit tool of Yayehiyahas. Now, according to the ethnographer Vern Ray, lightning was among the first spirits that shamans called upon in any ritual curing ceremony. And this was because lightning enabled shamans to see what could not otherwise be seen. Lightning, after all, illuminates even the night sky. And once again, by way of metaphor, any shaman who possessed lightning as a medicine was empowered to see into the dark world of spirits, which was located inside the earth. Or in terms of ritual curing, it enabled shamans to locate and identify the culprit spirits hiding nearby that had caused sickness and disease in the village. So essentially, lightning enabled shamans to reach diagnoses. Now, if you take a close look in the slide then, if you take a close look at the zigzag in the slide, you'll notice that there are a couple of circles appearing right about the middle, right here. And of course, these circles were apparently meant to depict eyes. Well, when you think about it, this image provides us with a very striking metaphor for a shaman's vision that has been supernaturally enhanced by the spirit lightning. My claim then is that this figure represents a shaman empowered to see into the world of spirits, or at least to see spiritual things that ordinary folks could not see, such again as the hidden cause of a person's sickness. So it's for this reason then that we see the lightning symbol associated with so many spirit figures depicted in Klamath Basin rock art. Lightning enabled shamans to see spirits, like Camous's sun disk here, a shaman's curing medicine, or like Skell, the mythical pine marten, a medicine spirit. Note the triangular shape of the head and the presence of his medicine stick right up here. And here we have lightning symbols intermixed with the field of spirits, like these skeletal figures, which, as you recall, are another manifestation of the spirit Skokes. Another depiction of a barn owl, or at least the top of his head right here, which we know now is another medicine spirit. And of course, we have this nucleated sunburst here, once again depicting Camous's medicine tool, another curing symbol. So Yahya-Hiyahas then, through his medicine tool, lightning, was the spirit that enabled shamans to see either the culprit spirits causing sickness and disease, or to see their own spirit helpers that lived inside the earth, otherwise called their medicines, which were their remedies for bad spirits. In short, lightning provided shamans with supernatural vision, and Yahya-Hiyahas was a spirit that provided that power. Damn. Now, one other thing that the myths tell us about Yahya-Hiyahas is that he has a strong, if somewhat unbalanced interest in fire drills and tobacco, especially tobacco. Whenever Yahya-Hiyahas encountered anyone in these tales, the first thing that he demanded was that they feed him tobacco smoke. And that's how you feed a spirit, with smoke. Well, that part really isn't too much of a mystery, since we know that shamans routinely use tobacco in conjunction with calling on their spirits. But what about his other requirement, that people carry around their fire drill? I mean, why would a spirit care whether or not you carried around your fire drill? Well, as it turns out, the story of the one-legged one quoted here in the slide actually provides us with a very significant clue. Now, in this tale, excuse me, in this tale, a group of hunters were camped on a mountaintop preparing for the coming hunt. Now, at one point during their preparations, the leader of the party suddenly took out his fire drill and started to spin it in the manner of starting a fire. Now, as he spun his fire drill, the rest of the company joined him as he started calling out to the mountain, seeking spirits to assist them in the coming hunt. Now, they intended to exclude Yahya-Hiyahas, which was a particularly powerful spirit that was dangerous, if not fatal, to those who were not initiated, those who were not shamans. But before they could instruct the fire drill not to call him, I said before they could instruct the fire drill not to call him, Yahya-Hiyahas appeared, demanding tobacco, as was his custom. And I don't think I need to tell you that the rest of the story didn't go too well for these poor hunters. But what's important to note here is that the story associated spinning the fire drill was calling out to the mountain in search of spirits, including the spirit Yahya-Hiyahas, who, as you recall, brings lightning, also known as supernatural vision, the ability to see spirits. Now, note in the story that spinning the fire drill not only produced a fire, it also produced a spirit. And that, my friends, is what brings us back to Petroglyph Point. See, we know that the makers of the petroglyphs had either paddled their canoes out to the rock face to create their designs, or they walked over the ice, probably both. Either way, I suggest that they would have had their fire drills with them, especially given its apparent supernatural properties. Because remember in the story, they not only used the fire drill to start a fire, they also use it to talk to spirits. And that, my friends, is exactly what I think is going on here. My claim is that shamans ritually drilled these holes into this rock face as a means of calling on their spirits, just like the myths describe. Now, in some cases, you see drilled holes directly associated with particular spirit figures, like the image we see here, Remember what I said about circles representing the sun disk of Camous and triangles representing the head of the mythical pine marten, Skell. This part of Petroglyph Point is where some enterprising shamans sought out contact with these particular spirits, following the conventions prescribed by myth. Now in this figure, excuse me, in this figure, you can see where the shaman artist didn't simply drill holes as they called out to their spirits, but they simultaneously created patterns that sometimes took on the form of the spirits themselves, like the diamond chain you see on the upper left. And I hope somebody asked me about that at the end. Excuse me. Diamond chain. Sorry, I lost my place here. At other times, they work to frame those spirits, like you see on the image on the right side of the crack. Sorry about that. Now, in this image, you can see holes drilled directly into this previously engraved triangular figure. Once again, the head of Skell, the mythical pine marten, a medicine spirit. Drilling holes into this figure was a direct appeal to the spirit Skell. So on Petroglyph Point, then, we see depictions of medicine spirit figures like Camous and Skell, as well as evidence of shamans making supplications to these spirits under the guidance of Yahas, indicated by the presence of drilled holes. See, drilling holes was a fundamental part of the supplication process, because drilling holes into a rock face, and thus not actually trying to start a fire, met the definition of counterintuitive labor. And thus you can equate this behavior to a shaman's version of a power quest, whose ritual actions were inspired and informed by myth. Remember, on a power quest, you're seeking spirits. Now, there's one last thing we need to talk about that involves Yahas, and that's the relationship between rattlesnakes and lightning. And I mentioned it before, but I was unaware of this relationship at first, rattlesnakes and lightning. But about 7-8 years ago now, I came across a curious statement in Leslie Spears' ethnography on the Klamath, in which he commented that the rattlesnake's rattling was believed to bring thunder. And of course, I thought that that was a rather odd belief, since it was so disprovable. I mean, really, all anyone would have to do when a rattlesnake rattled its tail was listen for the thunder. That's assuming, of course, you have the presence of mind to do it at that point. But when it didn't occur, as it very likely would not, then there goes your belief system out the window. But then it dawned on me that this statement may have been a reference to the spirit of thunder, which of course is Yahas. So did rattlesnakes rattle bring Yahas? And can we see this in the rock art? Well, we know that you can see Yahas implicated in the rock art by the presence of a spirit tool, which of course is lightning. So the test for me was, do we see lightning depicted in close association with anything in the rock art that might resemble a rattlesnake? Now here we have a rattlesnake that appears to be depicted in stick-figured form, using only straight or angled lines. And just in case it's a little hard to make out, you can see its rattle here, its elongated zigzag body here, and a diamond-shaped head with a protruding tongue here. Now, at first glance, we might easily assume that the artist simply chose to depict this rattlesnake in stick-figured form, instead of using curved or wavy lines like we'd expect. But in actuality, what we have here is a rattlesnake that has been transformed into this zigzag figure by the presence of Yahas, so that we have a figure that simultaneously depicts rattlesnake and lightning. And this is how we know that Yahas is present here. Recall once again that spirits manifest themselves by possessing their hosts and thus transforming them, just like we saw earlier with Skell depicted as a stylized human figure, essentially a human and Skell simultaneously. By depicting rattlesnake and lightning simultaneously, the artist indicated that Yahas, manifesting as a spirit tool lightning, was possessing the rattlesnake spirit and thus answering the rattlesnake summons. Now here we see a similar depiction, but one that also takes the habits of an ordinary rattlesnake into account. Excuse me. At first, you might think you're seeing two different figures. On the left, you see this large rattlesnake rattle, possibly in the act of rattling as implicated by the wavy lines that surround it. And on the right, you see another rattlesnake's body that has been transformed by the spirit lightning. Now, if you'll notice, both the rattle and the lightning body appear to be emerging from different parts of this large protrusion in the rock face right here. The rest of the rattlesnake is taken to be hidden underneath this protrusion, just like an ordinary rattlesnake would hide underneath a rock. So the suggestion then is that the artist used the natural topography of the rock face to indicate that he or she had summoned the rattlesnake and lightning spirits from the inside of this mountain, which of course was believed to be inhabited by spirits. But as you can see, there's still more going on here. All the drilled holes you see below this composition indicates that a shaman was making supplications to these spirits using a fire drill. So figuratively then, in terms of ritual procedure defined by myth, we can see that the shaman used two different methods to summon the spirit of thunder: a rattlesnake's rattle and a field of drilled holes, both of which were mythologically warranted. On Petroglyph Point, we encounter the very same elements. We can see a rattlesnake figure with its head here turned sharply upward, as though it were crawling into this small crack in the rock face just above it. And in fact, the head is understood to have already disappeared inside of this little crack. We can see hints of a rattle here that appears to be emerging from this other spalled off section of the rock face. And the implication, of course, is that the rattlesnake is emerging from one part of the rock face and crawling into another. So like you saw on the previous slide, the natural habits of an ordinary rattlesnake have been incorporated into this depiction to help convey a message. Now over here, you see a series of nested zigzags juxtaposed with this large crack in the rock face on the left. My claim is that these nested zigzags symbolize lightning. I'll tell you why in just a moment. And finally, we see shaman's medicine spirits manifested in the form of Camous's sun discs right down here. And if you look closely, we even see some repeated figures like this other rattlesnake figure here, and even some scattered drilled holes, which I didn't bother to mark. They're too widely scattered. But in short, in terms of ritual procedure defined by myth, we see everything we expect to see. And let me quickly add that it's no accident that no accident that these lightning motifs are juxtaposed with this large crack in the rock face on the left. I mean, when you think about it, this arrangement provides us with a very striking metaphor for the spirit of lightning illuminating the inside of this mountain, where spirits were known to live. So here then, with the assistance of Yahahiyahas, some shaman made contact with the medicine spirit, Camous, again indicated by the presence of his sun discs below. Okay. Not to put too fine a point on it, and I remember this composition from the beginning, the one we were coming back to. When we look at one of the more complex sections of Petroglyph Point, we can actually understand what went on here. The central figure, of course, is what? This long rattlesnake motif. And what is this long rattlesnake motif doing? It's cross-cutting this elongated zigzag figure here. Lightning, the symbol of Yahahiyahas. Now we know from our myths why this association is taking place, why these two figures are necessary for the rest of the composition. If you look closely, you'll also find plenty of drilled holes, which we know now are synonymous with calling spirits. And I've identified just a few sample groupings right here. And there are, of course, others. And intermixed with this scene, we find plenty of spirit figures, most of which are in the form of Camous's sun discs right here. And again, there are others, and there are other spirits here too that I have not identified for this presentation. Too much background information would take way too long. But once again, we see everything we expect to see. If a shaman had visited this site, made appeals to Yayakiyahas with the rattlesnake motifs, and then, assisted by his medicine tool, lightning, made supplications to these spirits living inside this mountain by ritually drilling holes into the rock face, calling spirits. And finally, their efforts were rewarded by the manifestation of the shaman's medicine spirits, in this case, Camusha sun discs. So here then is where a shaman or shamans, following a long and tedious ritualized process, made successful contact with the medicine spirit, Camus. So at the end of the day, Petroglyph Point is knowable. This is my claim. And it's knowable because we have a very strong informing context preserved in the form of our myths, our long overlooked sacred narratives. Remember, this mountain is basically a lodge for spirits, and shamans came here for generations immemorial in search of their supernatural powers. Now, my claim has been that the petroglyphs on this monument depict shamans' medicine spirits, as well as their ritualized efforts to contact those spirits with the assistance of rattlesnake, drilled holes, and yayahiyahas, as prescribed by myth. And what this means then is these are not merely geometrical abstract markings, and nor do they constitute ancient Scandinavian fish tallies. In fact, these markings are the prayers of our ancestors etched in stone. So myth provides us then with an effective mechanism for understanding a Klamath Basin rock art. But perhaps more importantly, most importantly, is that it provides us with the potential to understand the Petroglyph Point petroglyphs as my ancestors once did. Thank you. And I'm going to stop share right there. There we go. All right. I think I succeeded there.
Yeah, you did.
There we go.
Yes.
There we go. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Interesting talk. So at this point in time, people can use the chat to ask questions. And so we do have some right now. So there's a question about the drill holes. So is there any sense for sort of when they were made? Can you tell whether they were made over time? Are there differences in patination or type of drill holes that you could use to decide when they might have been produced?
Yeah. Right now, the only thing I can tell is that the more shallow ones tend to be the more patinated on the inside. So we know that when the water returned to that level, that they were patinated alongside the images. Now, how close they are to the images, in time, in terms of when they were made, I don't know. I haven't seen any yet that don't have some patination in them. It's just that the shallower ones are the more obvious ones. Other than that, I don't know. I can't tell you that.
Yeah. Is there a range of repatination on them indicating, potentially a long space of time for these petroglyphs, or were they, done within a certain, actually I guess we should ask, what do you know, if anything, about the time span, given when the lake was there and that kind of thing?
Well, as far as an upward date, I'm pretty convinced it was a Hayter and Lee's middle date. The one that was proposed by Cleghorn, the research that was proposed by Cleghorn, that when the environmental information, gleaned from other sites around the region, would help us to determine when the water was low enough for the petroglyphs to have been made, and then when it got high again, covered them up. Okay, well, they did a great job on deciphering that information and publishing it. I think it was 1990, 1991, somewhere in there. Anyway, the three dates, oh, God help me, I can't remember, but the first date was in the 6,000 year area somewhere, But the second date was between about 4,500 and 2,600 years ago. And then the third date was 500 years and closer to us now. But the second date is one I'm pretty convinced they were. And that's because shamanism appears to have showed up at Nightfire Island about that same time. And that's only about 20 miles away, maybe not even that far. And so, but the shamanic objects are unfortunately the same objects that the collector who had brought the site to the attention of the archaeologists of OSU, or U of O rather, Leroy Johnson, allowed him to keep collecting that, those marked fancy materials, which are exactly the shamanic materials I'm interested in. And so he used a pickaxe and no provenience, and a few of them survived, and a few of them that it was his name, Garth Sampson, who took control of the report afterwards, was able to associate at least with a particular level. That's about the 4,500 year time period. So that's the upward date then that I think is the beginning of Petroglyph Point, when the people who are us, I mean the Lake Marsh people, took control of the island and made it a permanent residence, and shamanism appeared there as well. As far as time periods, they came up with three time periods in their climatic their climatic research or project, whatever it was called. And like I said, the three dates that were about 6,000 years ago, and I can't remember the downward date for that period. And then 4,500 to 2,600, and then 500, apparently on forward from there, with some fluctuations. That's as much as I can tell you.
And just to clarify, those dates were chosen because that's when the water level would have been low enough for them to make them, and otherwise the lake level would have been above the petroglyphs?
Correct. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay, so it was, so for most of the history of that point, it was under a much deeper lake, and now it's gone completely.
Right. My research on that whole area, it used to be Pluvial Lake Modoc, which covered the whole region. And I forget how many hundreds of feet it was at the time.
Wow.
But Petroglyph Point was an island that was close to the southeast corner, but quite a bit further out, of course. And it remained an island actually until it was drained. It was a peninsula and an island, depending on how much flooding there was that year. It would become an island again. And so in the Miz, you hear it referred to as the mountain, the island, the peninsula, but the same piece of landmass is being described there.
Okay, some other questions have come in. One question was whether the recent wildfires have had any impact on this or other sites within the Lava Beds Monument.
Yeah, the Lava Beds asked me to come down and consult with them when the time comes. Right now, COVID's preventing us from doing the bear team thing, the post-fire assessment, especially of the July complex. Now, the one that they just started and lost control of further south, I don't know if that's going to have any impact. But for right now, I went to the lava beds with a student and my fiance the other day, and to Petroglyph Point rather. But we were going to have lunch at Captain Jack's Stronghold at the picnic area, and that's still ribboned off. And it looks like the moon. It's a wasteland out there right now. So we ended up having lunch in our cars facing each other, and that was about the best we could do.
What is the actual length of the panel there, or the panels there?
Oh, wow. Well, I don't know. Every year, because of my arthritic knees, it seems to get farther every year. But oh wow, it's a couple hundred meters maybe. Bill, or Helen, you probably know more about that than I do. So I didn't actually measure it. I just took a sample of the petroglyphs when I started my book.
But is it isolated to a particular part of that the cliff face, or do you find examples of it all the way around?
Well, the mountain has private area, and it has different land managers, governing some areas of the whole mountain, the whole peninsula now. Petroglyph Point has markings on both sides, and the one side is protected by the fence. Most of them are, and the other side is not. And for the most part, I didn't include any of those in this talk today. I haven't really done a thorough enough assessment of the other side yet. Did I miss the point here?
No, we're just kind of,
okay.
I think we're just trying to get a sense for the extent of the site. And is the kind of petroglyph the same throughout the circumference, I guess. Another question.
Yeah, there's two places where you find pictographs. The pictographs seemed a little more defined. One of them, TLK 95, after Ben Schwartz named that one when he was doing an assessment for the museum here, seems to be mostly medicine. Other kinds of rock art seem to be power quests or shaman spirit quests. And you would see a lot of grids, triangles, squiggles that Lewis, Williams, and Dawson called entoptic imagery, mixed with certain things that look like medicines. But medicines are pretty well defined. They're iconic images. You see them everywhere all the time, made the same way and whatnot there. But the other pictograph site, the one in Petroglyph Point itself, is just a couple of markings. I don't know why they're there, maybe just to interact with the rock face. But I don't see them as having any shape, or if they did, that part of them are gone. We need de-stretch out there in a big way.
Yeah. So your argument is that some of these figures that people would call abstract or entoptic even are actually, in a sense, representational or symbolic.
In some cases, because the conventions of Klamath Basin rock art seem to be extreme synecdoche. Okay, I mean, on steroids. They seem to also, because of the dream time, to put it, I can't think of another way to put it, but the dream time reality, I guess, or nature characterization of these images, sometimes they're okay with making it look like squiggles, but with enough markings to identify it as a particular spirit being. Now, whether they were consulting it or whether they had just acquired it, or whether they were using it actively as a medicine for a particular case, I don't know.
Okay. Someone was asking about the inverted pine branch, the vertical line with the sides going down on each side, with the line with the branches
Yeah,
going down.
Yeah, Skokes is sometimes the spirit Skokes takes on the form of a living fish or hides in the bodies of living fish. The only way you can demonstrate that is to draw something that might look like a fish and a skeleton. In other words, something that isn't alive, hence spirit. Sometimes the only way you can do that is to make a metaphor. I've seen no reason for them to draw trees, even though they may look like that. On the other hand, remember, my myth is my informing mechanism. If I'm wrong, I'm glad to be, as long as I know why. But right now I can't see that as anything but Skokes, a skeletal figure. But otherwise, outside of that, and outside, if I'm wrong about the Miz, I'm wrong about that, or I very am likely wrong about that. But right now, I'm kind of biased about the Miz as far as them being the informing mechanism here.
Yeah, and then you had also mentioned the diamond chain, right?
Oh yeah.
Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, can you think? Sometimes instead of drawing the owl's eyes, you just draw the outline of a not a barn owl, but let's just say a horned owl. So you got a pair of diamond eyes, and in fact, some of the rock art are just a couple of diamonds side by side, juxtaposed to symbolize the owl spirit. And then there's other characteristics too, like something that looks like a stomach with an upside down victim dinner, like an upside down quadruped, like a mouse. Well, owls swallow their prey head first, and so you tend to get that sometimes. And so those two are sometimes depicted together. But let's just say you wanted a lot of spirit vision. You have a spirit vision on steroids. Well, sometimes you might get a picture of eyes, but with lightning in them instead of pupils and irises. Or sometimes you might just get a lot of eyes at the same time. And here I think we have multiple supernatural vision of owl, barn owl, or not the gray owl, the horned owl. A lot of owls down here. That's what I'm thinking is going on there, that somebody has acquired the extra ability for diagnosing sickness and disease, supernatural vision. Yeah. That's why I think that's the spirit.
Does the culture also have ceramics?
And not that I know of. Yeah.
Doesn't. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything else, baskets or something that might have similar imagery on it?
I've looked into that. Most of the images that the basket makers have identified don't seem to be medicines, although quail you would think would be one because of its ability to break boundaries, something that can fly but prefers to walk, that type of thing. But I haven't seen that in the Miz yet. Now there's over 700 pages alone in one of the texts that I've come across. And then there's more, and I'm a teacher. I got a lot to read elsewhere. And let's not forget Donna's book chapter. Excuse me. Can we continue now?
Yeah. Somebody asked about Kumush acting like bear.
Yeah.
Is that something that shows up in the rock art at all? Anything that relates to that?
Didn't want to address this, but I think now understand there's still a lot I haven't read, but actually it was Don Hand and Gordon Bettles' paper, the House of the Rising Sun, where a Camous, in order to see out into the physical world, decided to take his fingernails and scratch the rock face. I would think then, because of the law of inversion, that a shaman would scratch the rock face to see into the spirit world. And that might explain all the tally marks that you see side by side, ritual scratching. That's right now a working guess. Okay, it's a little less secure than some of the other stuff I've said.
Uh-huh.
But right now, but that would be a mythologically warranted, at least avenue to follow up. But other than that, Camous imitating the bear and hibernating beneath Petroglyph Point indicates that he lives there. And hence people would go there to get his power.
Yeah. What about the rake figure? That's a common archaic figure. Does that show up there?
Nothing comes to mind, but I can't imagine it wouldn't. I just can't think of a specific example there or anywhere. Not usually in the paintings unless it's in a cave. Because the cave is where you tend to get the entoptic imagery, or there was power quest and whatnot. But some paintings right there on the village are just full of nothing but medicines, very clear, articulate, defined symbols. But you tend to get the entoptic stuff, further away from the village and whatnot. I imagine it would show up there, but right now I can't think of a specific example. Probably. Oh wait, yeah, I do remember one in Petroglyph Point. The two rake figures actually end up forming hands. I'm not sure exactly why yet, except that they were entoptic, or possibly entoptic.
We had a question of whether there was any relationship that you can pick out dealing with gender.
Not yet. This has come up, or I've been pondering it for a long time, because females had to wait to become shamans until after a menopause. Now in the Shasta, our neighbors, the Shasta people, men and women were shamans with the preponderance of women. And I haven't even started in that branch of research yet, though. But it makes me wonder if they were limited to certain medicines, or they just started in full throttle. I don't know. That is a good question, and one I want to follow up on.
Okay, here's another question. How did you evaluate the accuracy of the outsiders' interviews with the Klamath Modoc people? And to what extent did you speak to Klamath Modoc people who could confirm or deny the accuracy of outsider information?
I don't know if you know that I'm Klamath. I'm not an outsider, but right now, I'm pretty much the only one of us who's looked into this. I have ran into some that are willing to say pretty much anything, but I haven't. Let me backtrack. Back when I was doing my thesis, I was interviewing a lot of people, and couldn't get consensus. It was almost like an armchair, a statement. And I noticed that a lot of other things they were saying were different from what was in the ethnology, the ethnographies, and of course the mythology, which pretty much has the core of pretty much everything. And I don't think I stress that enough, that myth is everything. And I just hope there's more I can find, and someday I'll get the chance to finish reading through them and hearing what's out there being told. So what I've done is I've kind of formed this framework based on myth, ethnographic statements by ancestral peoples there. Songs are important because, again, they're the same thing as the spirits. And in fact, if Gatchett's list of songs are those spirits doing the talking through the person of the shaman. That's a wonderful interpretive mechanism. Well, anyway, so all this literature and these side note literatures that seem to get overlooked formed a wonderful framework against which to evaluate future statements. And this is how I interpret native perspective is that, well, let me just say it kind of in a romantic way. I talked to the ancestors first and then evaluated against what we know today.
Yeah.
Is that,
Did you hear some of the mythology when you were growing up, or did you kind of have to ask around in order to
well,
have people share that with you?
yeah, but I can't say I was a good student. I mean, when some of the older folks, when I'm over there playing basketball or chasing, well, my female peers, I was 14 or so. Come on, or showing off, I should say. I didn't have the courage to. But anyway, um, the myths that people like Uncle Reed and others wanted to tell us didn't seem so important. We just thought he was old and senile. Now I wish to God I'd listened to him. And Eddie Chiloquin, Neva Eggsman. I just wish to God I'd have sat down and listened because they were trying to pass this on, I think, obviously. There's still myths around. And in fact, old people and young people, grade schoolers and whatnot, they have the time to get out in the woods and this information, that mountain is sacred. Here's who lives there. This is why. That kind of information that pertains largely to the general power quest is largely available. Okay, the stuff I'm talking about takes a different kind of knowledge, I think.
So the power quest is different from the shaman's work.
Completely, yeah.
The
shamans were specialized. They had a spirit quest, but that's because they were looking for particular medicines that could help them. But these kind of spirits were considered dangerous and deadly to those who weren't initiated into shamanism. But the power quest is for pretty much everybody. You can get power for pretty much anything that's difficult, like being a good gambler or a good trader, a good warrior, things like that. That's pretty much general spirit power called sputu. But the shaman's medicines were specialized, meant for curing, seeing into the future, things like even distance assassinations against other enemy shamans in distant villages, things like that, witchcraft, if you will.
Yeah.
Those are dangerous and deadly, and they took training like up to 5 years under the mentorship of other shamans before they'd turn you loose and let you do your own initiation ceremony, basically a feast of magic tricks, and then you were ready to start curing. That's a whole different ritual process they have there.
Yeah. Do you think any of the rock art might have been related to the more generic power quest as opposed to the shamanic medicine quest?
I haven't seen any yet. Usually when we did power quests, and I think Grandpa Lloyd, my grandfather, was the last person in our family to go, unless Reed did. He might have. He probably did, actually. And he only died in the 90 or 89, I think. Anyway, the whole point, what you hope to gain from that ritual is not just the spirit power of a particular spirit that lives nearby. Scamdi is a popular one. But they would give you its song. And that was pretty much it. So you had a spirit power that you can invoke with your song, but making art doesn't seem to be, or markings doesn't seem to be these markings, from what I understand from the myths and from the ethnography, were loaned to the shaman by the spirits themselves. Okay, now I haven't seen anything outside of that yet, outside of that shamanic framework yet. There might be, I just haven't seen it yet, or can't come to recognize it yet.
Yeah. So the goal for the more general power quest would be to come back with a song.
Yeah, a song that you can invoke your helper with, the one that's going to keep you out of trouble or help you to recover from serious illness, things like that. All else fails, then you call the shaman. He or she comes with more medicine and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, just a slight revision on the question regarding the question of accuracy. Yeah, just sort of where do you feel in terms of the accuracy of the references that you cited, given your interviews with various people?
Well, we just finished a documentary, myself and the Klamath tribes. Well, I wrote the documentary, and then, but to address this kind of question, we showed my citations in frame in the just like we would in a book. We showed the in-text citations, and I gave them a bibliography afterwards because they know there's some people that are going to challenge this. And I'm happy to be wrong. I just want to be shown why, and so I can revise my opinion or drop it altogether. What I have cited, I have backed up. What I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know. And there is a lot I don't know yet, especially about Petroglyph Point. Those two, the hourglass looking figure, the two, they're kind of juxtaposed around that fissure in the rock face. There's one of them. I think I know what it is, but I'm not willing to say so just yet. One, because I can't stand the laughter from my, oh no, never mind.
Yeah. So what kind of reception do you get? Because you're trying to relate the myths that you hear to what you see on in the rock art, right?
Yeah.
What kind of reaction do you get from other people, other Klamath Modoc?
Very positive, very strong, but I do challenge some people, and they are very defensive about it, and you just you have to let them deal with it. I'm not here to take anybody's job or to take anybody's stick, but I do think that this information belongs to the people. If for any other reason that it's one of us doing it, I could be totally wrong, but for the first time, we're not being colonized by somebody else's idea of Scandinavian fish tallies or ancient aliens. We're actually talking about it in our own cultural terms. Even if I'm totally off my rocker, I accept that. But for once, it's people being interested in it enough to take to care to do it. Now that's just me. There are a lot of people, and I do hear other people, talking in council. Hey, Dave did this or Dave did that. And that's great. I need a crew. Okay, so let's put our money where their mouth is. No, there's a lot of positive feedback, and there are a few who are disgruntled because they think I'm here to get their job, and I'm not. That's just, I think you're going to find that in any community.
Yeah. Is there a sort of alternative interpretation that you find, also could potentially have merit?
I haven't seen one yet. Well, let me backtrack. And I want to look at what Schwartz did. And I'm Klamath Basin Petroglyphs. He wasn't trying to find the characters that I was finding. What he was trying to do is use it to form a temporal framework and to associate it with its entrance into the region. Okay, so he's using broad, large-scale analyses that an archaeologist would use if they're trying to answer questions like that to establish temporal frameworks and general. So this is a level of interpretation still. Whether he's right or wrong is a different story. But I don't evaluate it on my terms because I'm using something very specific and local. So there's two interpretations there that aren't conflicting, but they could both be right and they could both be wrong. Mm-hmm. Is that I'm not trying to be evasive, but I just wanted to make sure that that there were different interpretations that might not have to do with the characters themselves, but more or less the style or the rendering technique, as Schwartz was interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we probably have one last question, which relates to, I guess there's a dam that's going to be removed from the Klamath River. And the question is whether that may end up reviving the lake in that area.
It'll probably bring the salmon back if they haven't killed them already. I have heard about this just recently. I don't have a TV or anything, and I'm in my little trailer here, just trying to teach and write books and stuff. I'm writing down Donna's book chapter and everything. You heard that, Donna. Anyway, but I don't really. I hate to say that my crime is not keeping up with current events. I only heard about the dam removal only recently, like in the last couple of weeks. I know it'll probably bring the salmon back, but if they don't clean up that lake, it's really toxic with that algae because they keep holding it up and they're not punishing the polluters, who we know who they are too, and the large scale polluters that are toxifying that lake and wiping out populations of the chwam, the sucker, and I can't imagine the salmon are going to be too happy there either, but that's where they would go before going up the various rivers elsewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know, I hope. But I think it's going to have to go hand in hand with cleaning up that lake too.
Yeah. One other question just came in. Are you aware of any acoustic characteristics of the site?
Not yet. That was brought up recently, in fact. And very interesting. And in fact, at the last SAA I was at, like in 2015 or something like that, I won the paper. The guy who actually brought that up in the caves. I, I won the drawing and got his paper on the idea, but I haven't seen anything like that in the month of Klamath yet. I think you're going to find acoustics, inadvertently in caves, but that might not mean it was intentional. Let me quickly add, though, that songs were very much a part of gathering that power, especially for the first time. So acoustic might have been. And my own son, who's written some music for the documentary, we took him into one of those caves to play it and to record it. But I can't imagine we being the first Klamath in our thousands of years worth of history here being the first ones to think of that, in our own terms, of course.
Yeah.
I just haven't seen it yet. And maybe that's because I'm blinded by myth right now. I haven't tried anything else recently.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was a lot of interesting questions and discussion, and it's
good questions.
It'll be fascinating to see sort of where you go with this. We'll certainly look forward to seeing a documentary. So again, thank you very much for your presentation. Thanks to the attendees for your interest. Again, if you'd like to learn more about ARARA and our virtual conference coming up in June, please check out our website, our Facebook pages. And so remember, our virtual conference will be June 12th to 13th, and you can get more information from that online. And until then, good evening and stay safe.